Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's virtual Ernst Fraenkel Prize talk, Joanna Sliwa in conversation with Natalia Aleksiun. The Wiener Holocaust Library is delighted to be hosting this event in honor of Dr. Sliwa's joint award of the 2020 Ernst Fraenkel Prize. And I'm going to begin by saying just a few words about the library and then a few words about the prize, but I'm going to keep my comments very short because I can't wait to hear from our excellent speakers. The Wiener Holocaust Library was founded in the winter of 1933 in Amsterdam, and it was founded by Dr. Alfred Wiener, who was a German Jewish scholar and political activist, who had been working previously in Berlin against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. After being forced into exile in 1933, Wiener established the Jewish Central Information Office in Amsterdam, and this was a documentation center and hub for a group of mainly Jewish refugees who were determined to record Nazi crimes and to raise the alarm about Nazism across the world. Today, what was once the JCIO Amsterdam is the Wiener Holocaust Library London. As well as providing access to its globally significant collections, the library runs a vibrant series of exhibitions and events each year, like tonight's event. Our collection of over 2 million items is the oldest of its kind anywhere in the world, and it includes published and unpublished works, press cuttings, photographs, eyewitness testimony, and many more fascinating and important materials. Since moving to London, the library's reinvented itself many times, and one of those reinventions, which took place in the mid-1980s, led to the creation of the Fraenkel Prize. The founder of the prize, Ernst Fraenkel, who was himself a refugee from Nazism, was a wonderful, warm man who is still much missed by people connected to the library, and including myself and including his children, Martin and Ellen, who I'm delighted to say are joining us this evening. As an indication of this, just last week I met for the first time the author David Price-Jones, who wrote an important book on Unity Mitford. David worked with Ernst for many years, and it was a pleasure to speak with him. David himself is a Jewish refugee from Nazism, and David had many fond memories of reading of serving on the board of the Fraenkel Prize and reading its fantastic entries over many years and sharing thoughts about them with Ernst. And Ernst was completely dedicated to the prize, and also, I think, took a great deal of pride in the way it supported promising scholars. It was really touching to see how passionate Ernst was about that. The very first Fraenkel Prize was awarded 34 years ago in October 1988. The winner was Professor Margaret Steig of the University of Alabama, and she won for her work on public libraries during the Holocaust. Since then, there has been an astounding number of innovative studies, many of them path-breaking, and the prize has recognized them, helped to disseminate their findings, and has become a truly prestigious prize. And so it's absolutely my pride and pleasure to be here this evening for the 2022 Fraenkel Prize talk. I'm sure you'll be as excited as me to hear from Dr. Joanna Sliwa about her book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust. And to introduce Joanna and Natalia, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Christine Schmidt, who is the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the library. And among the many amazing things Christine does for the library is coordinating the Fraenkel Prize. So over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. I'm really delighted to have the task of organizing tonight's talk and introducing our speakers. The winner of our joint, I just have to make a correction, she won the 2020 Ernst Fraenkel Prize. We will have another Fraenkel Prize lecture later this year, but our 2020 Ernst Fraenkel Prize winner was Joanna Sliwa. She is a historian of the Holocaust and Polish Jewish history. Dr. Sliwa works as historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or also known as the Claims Conference, the only NGO that negotiates with the German government for compensation for Jewish Holocaust survivors. She has worked at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and has taught at Kean University and at Rutgers University. She was jointly awarded the Ernst Fraenkel Prize in 2020 for her book manuscript, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, published by Rutgers University Press in 2021. And I'm especially delighted to introduce her as a fellow graduate of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, where she earned her doctorate in 2016. She will be led in conversation by Dr. Natalia Aleksiun, who is the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville. She holds doctoral degrees from Warsaw University and NYU. She specializes in the social, political, and cultural history of modern East European and Polish Jewry and the Holocaust. Aleksiun has written extensively on the history of Polish Jews, the Holocaust, Jewish intelligentsia in East Central Europe, Polish-Jewish relations, and modern Jewish historiography. In addition to her 2021 book, Conscious History, Polish-Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, she is the author of Where to? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950, which was published in Warsaw in 2002, and co-editor of several volumes, including Poland, Studies in Polish Jewry, volume 29, with Brian Horowitz and Antony Polonsky, and European Holocaust Studies, volume 3, with Hanna Kubetova. She also serves as co-editor of East European Jewish Affairs. And currently, she is a senior fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. So she is not in sunny Florida at the moment, as we just learned. She's completing a new book about Jews and hiding in Eastern Galicia during the Holocaust. So I would like to hand the floor over now to Natalia and Joanna.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. King. Oh, I just heard some echoing. Okay, I would like to thank you, Dr. Simpson. Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for hosting this program. Thank you, Professor Aleksiun, for joining me for the discussion. We are on first name basis, so after this, I will not pretend that we are not.
What a relief.
Yes, I just want to say that it is a really great honor for me to have been awarded an Ernst Fraenkel Prize for 2020 for my book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust. I would like to thank the committee members for recognizing this research. And I congratulate the co-winner of the prize, Dr. Andrew Kornbluth, and the finalist, Dr. Elizabeth Anthony. I would really like to thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy day or evening and attend this webinar. And I would like to recognize the Fraenkel family who is with us today. The prize carries a special meaning for me. Ernst Fraenkel himself, as we just learned, was a refugee. He was a child during the Holocaust. He was not even 10 years old when his life suddenly changed with the Nazi rise to power in Germany. He experienced firsthand the growing persecution of Jews. And eventually in 1939, he had to separate from his family. He had to leave his home and flee from Germany to England on a Kindertransport. And Ernst was only 16 years old at that time. In my book, although it is not about life in Germany or survival on the Kindertransport, it explores what life was like during the Holocaust for young Jews such as Ernst Fraenkel.
So, Joanna or Joanna, I also want to say that it's a great honor and pleasure to be here with you today in this conversation. This is a project that I loved as you were working on your dissertation and as you turn it into this moving, important, nuanced, rich book. And if you haven't read it, go grab it and read it. But I hope we can give you a little bit of a taste today of the content, but also of the historian's craft of how this book came to be and how it came to use the sources, what questions, and what questions remained. Please post your questions in a chat so that we will have a chance to get to them towards the end of the session. So I want to start with the statement that you make in the introduction, where you wrote at its core, this book is about people and a place. And I want to start with a place, with Kraków. If you could tell us about your choice, about a choice of this particular city to tell a microhistory of the Holocaust, what it meant in the story that this was fourth largest Jewish community before, that it was the capital of Generalgouvernement, how the choice of the place affected the narrative that you got to write.
So I think that the response to this question requires a few words about what led me to the topic of exploring Jewish children's experiences during the Holocaust, specifically in Kraków. And I was inspired by two images. I am not too original in that I was intrigued by the only colored figure in Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List of the girl in the red coat. So in the film, her experiences sort of merge with those of adult Jews. And yet the child is highlighted. And this forces the viewer, not only encourages, it forces the viewer to take note of that girl. I wanted to learn the names and the histories of the children whom this girl represented. So that's one image. The second image that led me to an interest in Kraków is a photograph taken by the Russian Jewish photographer Roman Vishniak in 1937. This is a very famous photo. It shows the silhouettes of what appear to be religious Jewish men in a courtyard in Kazimierz, the former Jewish district of Kraków. And the caption of that photo reads something like the entrance to Kazimierz, the old ghetto of Krakow. And seeing that, I asked myself, was this an accurate representation of Krakow's Jewish history? And I came to realize, of course, that photography and cinematography create these really powerful and enduring symbols that often stand in for history for some viewers and can facilitate engagement with history for others. So my book was inspired by these two iconic images related to Kraków, but the book goes beyond the iconic stories. And so now I can get into the question of the significance of Kraków in Holocaust history. So as Natalia, you mentioned, the Jewish population in Kraków was the fourth largest in Poland, and the eve of World War II, Jews comprised about 25% of the city's population. This was an important city in Jewish life in pre-war Poland. It was called by some the Jerusalem of Galicia. So one of many Jerusalems, right? This was of Galicia. And then during the Nazi era, the city assumed new roles. And I was interested in what those roles were and how did they affect what Jews experienced during that time. So until the outbreak of the war, Kraków served as this refuge for German and Austrian Jews who were fleeing persecution, some of them who were expelled from their homes. After the German invasion, Kraków became this place of asylum and also a transit site for expellees from Western Poland, from areas that were annexed to the Reich. And then in March 1941, the German authorities created a ghetto in the city. And at the same time, the Aryan non-Jewish side of Kraków served as this shelter for Jews in hiding and living under false identities. Another role of Kraków that I became very interested in it is that Kraków as a departure point for trans-border rescue missions from German-occupied Poland to first to Slovakia, to Hungary, Romania, and even on to Palestine. And then we have another layer of the role of Kraków in Holocaust history, And that is, from the German perspective, the city was the center, as you mentioned, Natalia, of German command. It was the seat of the Kraków district. It was the capital of the general government. And very importantly, this was supposed to be the model Germanic city in occupied Poland. Kraków was also a German industrial base. It was part of the forced and slave labor schemes and a concentration camp system. So we have these different functions of Kraków that shape the experiences of all Jews, adults and children during the Holocaust. And I was very much interested in learning more about these functions.
And we'll come back to it, but what also I think makes Kraków so interesting, and you spend a chapter on it, is Płaszów, right? There's the life in the ghetto, there's the life on the Aryan side, and then there is existence of and in Płaszów. But we'll get to it, hopefully. I want to go now a little bit more to the people, and you have a cast of amazing characters, children themselves, their parents, their relatives, members of various institutions that are engaged in trying to protect Jewish children. If you can talk a little bit about the choices that you made, also what childhood means, the ages that you chose to decide for the characters, how this came to be the cast of characters that there is in this book.
What a wonderful question. In terms of the definition, that is something I very much struggled with, how to define a child and how to define childhood. Because of course, childhood is a fluid concept, right? Who gets to decide when childhood ends? I mean, is it 12 years old, 14 years old? Who gets to decide? And so as I was working on doing research on this topic and reading and listening to children's testimonies, which I hope we will get to sometime later on, I came to the realization that it was the German definition, right, that mattered the most for who was considered a child during that time. And that definition also varied. So in the beginning, we have Jews who were Jews who were 12 and above, 12 years and over, were required to perform labor. So in this way, these Jews 12 years and over were treated more or less as adults. And then the legislation changes about a month or so before the creation of the ghetto, when when adults are defined as all Jews of 14 and over. So that was the definition that I went along. So so Jews who were up to the age of 14 during the time of persecution, those are the children that I write about.
And yeah, go ahead.
And in terms of the cast of the cast of characters and the stories that I chose to focus on in the book, that was probably one of the hardest parts about working on this, because I wanted to include all of those stories. And you know this, and anyone who works on this topic knows, it's just such a hard choice. But then you have to make these hard decisions about, perhaps which stories, which children. There's a few children whose stories apply throughout the book, and I weave their stories throughout the book. And that was a very difficult choice because everyone had their own history to tell. They had important things to tell about their feelings, about their thoughts, about their experiences, about how they recollected, remembered what was happening to them at the time, what was happening to them individually, what was happening to their families. So that was a difficult choice, yes.
So about those choices, I wonder, and this is not specific to Kraków, but I wonder, how did you think about this problem that I think all historians of the Holocaust face, which is being skewed by stories of children who survived? And you cite, I was struck by a lot of the stories of very young children, and we'll come back to it when you show how age and gender and physical appearance and size and sheer luck or chance shaped those paths to survival, and those children that did not. But how did you deal with the fact that at the end, what you had the most were accounts of the children who were lucky to survive?
Yes. So I think that this is a great question, because it is significant that the availability of the source base determines who gets to tell their histories, right? And it's important to understand that Kraków was not Warsaw, was not the Warsaw Ghetto, and so there was no organized effort to collect documentation about the persecution of Jews in Kraków. So you won't find diaries written by children at the time, short text or drawings. So of course, as a historian, you have to you have to kind of cast your net wide and to capture the histories. So I had to look into post-war documentation, memoirs, testimonies, post-war court documents, newspapers, so all kinds of sources, to think broadly about where I can find snippets of information about children to kind of stitch together a history about them.
And so back to the question of the perspectives, when you talked about the definition, it was interesting because what it eventually means that you adopt the perspective of the perpetrators, right? When you whether you like it or not, this turns out to be the most important definition of who is a child, and therefore who is in the center of your book. But I think what's also interesting is that for me, reading the book, is that this is not Warsaw, and this is also not a smaller provincial ghetto, and the non-Jewish Poles, the Jews, and the Germans are all very much present in the story, right? There is a number of perspectives of the victims, of the perpetrators, of the bystanders, and all those gray zones in between. So if you could talk a little bit about the grown-ups, as it were, in your book, and we'll come back to the children in a moment.
Okay. So I'm really glad that you pointed out this interconnectedness, right? You have Jews, Polish non-Jews, and Germans in the city. So just to note about Kraków, and it was not Warsaw or other places, right? It was special also in that way, that many of the Jews in Kraków before the war were what they called themselves assimilated. Now we would understand that term differently today, assimilation. I think more in our terminology today, the way we understand these terms, I think we would call them acculturated. Maybe to some extent integrated into the fabric of Krakow's professional social life, but there were still certain divisions, right? And people kept to themselves because of their religious practice, social networks, and family ties, and so on. But these networks existed, and they were crucial for the survival of many of the children that I write about. So in this way, I think, I don't know, I'm not sure if this is the answer that you're looking for, kind of this direction.
The direction is yours.
The direction, yes. Right. So in terms of looking at adults, so of course it was impossible to study only the children. I had to look at adults, and whenever possible, I read accounts. I listened to the testimonies of parents of the children who parents who survived. Right. I also looked at testimonies of and read memoirs of witnesses, right? What did they observe? What was happening? Did they write anything about children? Were children significant at all in their memories of that time period? And of course, adults played a key role in the children's survival. And there is an entire cast of characters of these adults. We have former nannies and household help, right, who were, many of whom were aid givers, rescuers of these children during the time. There are blackmailers and informants, denouncers. There are Polish policemen who are part of this story as well, who influenced the fate of the children. And yeah. I think in terms of adults also, what I really wanted to bring to light, and I hope I managed to do that in some way, is the role of Jewish adults as rescuers of other Jews. I think that was very important for me to emphasize.
Yeah, I think that what makes this book for me so powerful and so informative is also, while this is a book about children, you really make sure to embed them in their lives before, in their families, in their relatives that they loved, and dolls that were taken away, and the toys they had to leave behind when they left Kraków, trying to and became refugees, or when they left because they had to move to the ghetto. So there is that emotional network, even if those grown-ups don't speak, because you use the testimonies, you use the words of the children, but they talk about themselves in this familial context. And then there are all these communal activists and teachers and pedagogues. And again, what I find so interesting about this book, that while you treat rescue and self-rescue and annunciation, but the earlier chapters, when we see how both grown-ups and children are trying to understand what is happening around them, how to adapt to it, what strategies they can come up with, right? You write about this concealed life of children that are sort of removed physically from the eye view of the Germans as soon as parents and communal activists understand that this is the way to go. So there is this fascinating line of continuity in efforts to protect children, efforts that can only succeed that much. But you also write about emotions and daily life. So if you could give us a little bit of a taste of what you uncovered about childhood emotions and about daily life experiences of Jewish children in Kraków.
What a great question, and about also about emotions. And I think you touched on so many of it when you're speaking about protecting the children as well. And I think one of the things that really stands out when I think about emotions in the context of the topic of this book is fear, absolute fear, fear for your own. Not surprisingly, right? Fear for your own life, but fear of your neighbors, really. And this is not something, this is not a finding that is particularly, earth-shattering here, right? It's confirmation of what we already know. And it's further proof of what we already know, that the children, their parents, the children's rescuers feared their neighbors, their non-Jewish neighbors. And they lived with that fear. That fear defined their decisions, their behavior, everything. But I also appreciated what you said about, these kind of the children's microcosm, let's say, of life, right? What mattered to these children? What did they feel emotional about? What did they feel attached to, right? And these are things that you will not find in accounts of adults, right? About this child taking her doll, or the fact that they were not allowed, or the child was not allowed to take books. Also fantasizing, right? As an, I think, emotional response to persecution as a coping mechanism. So what do children do, and how do children cope with difficult situations? They fantasize about what could be. They form friendships. They play. They rebel. So this is something as well that I found in while doing research for this book, that it applied to the children and how they found coping mechanisms, either on their own or together with their peers, to really handle the situation and try to understand it and adjust to it.
So about these daily life experiences, the book moves chronologically, but also thematically. If you could share with us those turning points in, there's no one average life story. They each is different, but what are the main moments in which the lives of Jewish children in Kraków changed?
There are several of them, and that's also why I chose this chronological arc, because you need to understand, right, what happens on a certain timeline and how that affects choices, decision, behavior, and later on how it affects choices taken later on. So, of course, the outbreak of the war is a major turning point. The arrival of the Germans, the curiosity that the children had about who are these soldiers? What does that mean for us? The fascination that boys had when they saw tanks and they saw weapons, right? But also very quickly, these children realized that this is not, what they read about books about war. This is not something to be happy about. This spells something bad for them, right? This is how they
I'll just interrupt you with one detail that stayed with me when you quote, I think it was a girl who said that she was happy because she thought she wouldn't need to go to school, which seemed like such a banal, wonderfully normal response, and I thought it was fascinating that the survivor actually retained that memory and was willing to share it, right? To share this naivete of a child who thinks, great, she will get a little longer vacation. But please, Jan, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Exactly. No, thank you for pointing that out, because in the book there are actually, I think I bring up 2 examples, and so that only shows that this was not an exception. Like child survivors actually talked about it. That would spell, kind of delay in starting school, and the opportunity to spend more time at home with their peers, with their nannies, right? So they didn't understand what was happening. But of course, once German officers, bureaucrats started arriving, they needed places to live. And so what happened? These Germans were placed sometimes in the homes of Jewish families. And then those homes were expropriated. So this is another turning point for children, the loss loss of safety, loss of their homes, and also a little bit earlier than that, loss of their loved ones, meaning some of the Jewish men, their fathers, brothers, uncles, left from Kraków going towards Lviv, right? Because they thought they would be safer there. So you have this break right there that really quickly children started realizing that something really negative is happening in their lives. In terms of other major turning points, then of course it's the explosion from Kraków between May and November 1940, and this is in line with Nazi policy toward making the city Germanic, free of Jews, and expelling the Jews from the city, keeping only the ones who were deemed beneficial for the German war effort.
That would not be children, obviously.
That would not be children. However, the immediate families, so the children of those adult Jews who were deemed useful, could stay in Kraków. Of course, ghettoization, another major turning point, right? And the actions in Kraków, the liquidation of the ghetto, and then the transfer of Jews deemed able-bodied and useful to the Płaszów camp.
And you do take it also to that space, time in between, right? The life, the concealed life after the ghetto is liquidated, and not in Płaszów, but rather on the Aryan side. And then you peek into the post-war period. So we really get chronologically, I think it's incredibly rich, that whole scope from literally the first days of the war, or even before the war, right? You start with the feelings and knowledge or lack of knowledge of the impending war, all the way to the returning to Kraków in a way after liberation. If you could share with us, maybe give those of us who our guests in the audience who didn't read yet the book a peek into your findings about the aspects of children's life and background, and how this may have shaped their specific trajectories, their specific experiences. You mentioned boys, so gender and age and background. If you could give us a little bit of that.
Yes, so certainly these factors shaped how children experienced the war. How old were they during that time? Were they a little older, meaning they could take on certain roles, they could take more initiative, they could be more active in their efforts to survive. And so one of the most incredible stories is of Janka Warszawska. And I have to credit my former professor, Shelley Tannenbaum from Clark University, for bringing this story to my attention. It was her aunt. And when she learned that I'm working on this topic, she said, "I have something for you," and she brought me a copy of her aunt's testimony. And this was an incredible child who was a young teenager in 1942, and she very quickly assumed roles that were beyond anything. She started smuggling food, providing for her family, but she was older. She was a girl, meaning boys had a harder time. Obviously, they were circumcised. The authorities could detect them. Informants could detect them more easily. Janka didn't look stereotypically Jewish, and I mentioned this. Stereotypes did matter during this time, during the Holocaust. We need to talk about it. What did it mean to look Jewish? Well, she had a finer color of hair, lighter skin. She knew Polish very well. She knew the customs from around Kraków. She was from that area. So it was easier for her to fit in. So she assumed these new roles as a smuggler of goods, but with the danger increasing in the Krakow ghetto, some parents began to ask her to take out their children, smuggle them out from the ghetto onto the Aryan side for hiding. And she did that. So I think this is like a great example of how some of these factors that you mentioned, Natalia, how they mattered and shaped the children's experiences.
And the chance, you write about the chance as well. How do you deal with the chance as a historian? I think it's easier to come up with a narrative that figures in good Polish, blonde hair, being a girl rather than a boy, but there is all that side that many survivors convey right in their testimonies, that ultimately this was their luck.
Yes, and here I have to say that, and I see that my wonderful mentor, Deborah Dwork, is here, and she has written so much, and her work deals with this fortuitous circumstances and luck and timing that explains so well how what allowed some children, some Jews, to survive the war. And happenstance, coincidence, of course, plays a role in the children's experiences. And I try to highlight that, but I think I didn't do that every time to say, but luck, played a role. I think the stories show, I hope that the stories show that no matter what you did, you could have, had all these advantages of your appearance, of language, of knowing the geography and so on, of having networks, of having kind of like a privileged position even, or your parents had a privileged position, but still there was luck. There was the proper timing that mattered.
I do think that you find an incredibly difficult balance to find, but you do, between showing agency, and you talked earlier about self-rescue, right? And you just mentioned one teenager that becomes not only a self-rescuer but a rescuer of others, and yet the limits to that agency. I think it's very difficult to find this moment. I want to ask you. I know we have only that long, and we would love to ask our audience for their questions as well. But I would love to ask you at least two more questions. One, if you could talk a little bit about space. I think you, in the chapter on escape and hiding, you write about it, but also in other about the rooms and streets and institutional settings, that the physicality of those spaces in which daily life, in which children live their childhood in Kraków. If you could give us a little bit of your findings there.
Okay, so there is a lot to say about this, for sure, about how space and place affected children's experiences and persecution, for sure. I think I would like to focus on, this is one of the most illuminating parts of this work for me, was about welfare efforts on behalf of children, and the creation of these different places where children, refugee children, could find a shelter, right? And other places that were divided in a way by gender. So these were, let's say, for boys, daycare for girls, and also divided by age. So that already shows alertness and awareness that different age groups have different needs, right? And so these child activists and staff of these various child welfare institutions, they were already experiencing so many restrictions on their work, and still they managed to create these spaces for children to be cared for, to receive the attention that their age group demanded.
I will now pick, before I ask you my question, I'll pick from the chat Professor Deborah Dwork, a pioneering scholar of research of childhood herself. So Deborah asks, could you speak about hiding in religious institutions and access to their records? So both your findings, but also your way to these findings.
What a great question. And again, so much to say about it. I could not include everything that I found in this short book. However, there is a chapter coming out in a volume that Natalia is editing on Jewish childhood in Poland. So I invite you to look at that for more detail. But I will say that this was one of the, there are a lot of ideas about how Catholic institutions behaved, how the clergy behaved, how nuns behaved during the Holocaust. What were their responses? Did they rescue? Did they not rescue? Did they try to convert the children or not? And so I was really interested in this issue, and I contacted all of the religious orders in Kraków, and some of them invited me.
They're in the same places that they were in during the war?
Yes, the ones that existed during the war. I did my research and I contacted all of those places. And some of them invited me, they showed me records. And of course, these are private institutions. So their records are not just available in any archive. You need a special permission and so on. And this is fascinating information because, for example, the Ursuline sisters, and I do not recall the full name, it has a long full name, but it's the Ursuline sisters. They have an amazing archive with testimonies of nuns, of questionnaires about children, of record books from the wartime, in which they write in code about caring for children. This was fascinating information, and so of course there were several of those Catholic institutions in the city that took in individual children. This was not a mass effort. We were talking about individual children only, but there were also institutions that the nuns operated outside Kraków. And so they took the children there too, to their vacation homes, to their branches in smaller towns. So there are a few survivors that I spoke with, and the testimonies of one of them, of Janina, is included in the book. And those experiences varied. The assessment of what the nuns did varied, of course. Some children had more positive experiences than others. Janina was older; she understood the risks. She understood how she was supposed to behave in that convent in order not to be recognized. But also another important thing about Catholic institutions to mention is that they were part of networks. In Kraków, they cooperated with, for example, with Jagota, the Council for Aid to Jews, that started in Kraków in March 1943. And so some of the examples that I have in the book is actually, of these resistance of women, non-Jewish Polish women in the resistance, who brought the children to specific convents because they knew that these convents would take them at least for some time.
This actually takes me naturally to the question that Naomi asked, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. My mother survived in hiding in Kraków with her mother from end 1942 to spring of 1944. They were helped in finding places of hiding. Did you come across rescue organizations helping Jews find places of hiding and by providing funds? So I guess you could tell us a little bit more about Jagota in this context.
Right. So thank you, Naomi, for sharing your family story. I hope we can connect afterwards. Yes, of course. So Council for Aid to Jews, Jagota, emerged in Kraków just on the eve of the liquidation of the ghetto in March 1943, which left very little time to find hiding places, people willing, non-Jews willing to hide the Jews, to find Jewish children and persuade their parents to give up their children so that they could be placed on the Aryan side. And so the Jagota operation in Kraków district was not as large as it was in Warsaw, but it did exist, and there is some good research about this in Polish, unfortunately, not in English. But one of the couriers in this, couriers, but also a major person in this operation, was a Jewish woman, Maria Hochberg-Mariańska. And this goes back also to what I said earlier about the importance of highlighting Jews rescuing other Jews.
Yeah, I think that the perspective on Jagota has been changing recently, and I think that your book also adds to that discussion, showing more and more Jagota as a sort of a Polish-Jewish institution with very active Jewish activists engaged in the efforts of rescue. Let me raise a question that Hamutal wrote in a chat, which was a version of something I wanted to ask as well. Could you talk about the problems you faced or haven't with relying on mostly post-war testimonies taken by adults speaking retrospectively about their experiences as children? So we're back to methodological challenges of a scholar of the Holocaust.
Thank you, Hamutal, and it's so nice to see you here. Of course, so there's much to say about the use of testimonies of children, but also of adults. I will say this, that of course, as opposed to adults, children rarely provide exact dates or names. What they do provide are their recollections, their own personal recollections, their assessment of what transpired to them, to their families, what the children witnessed, how they felt, what they thought at that time. And this is the type of information that I was most interested in, and something that really cannot be gleaned from other types of sources. And of course, it's not that my book relies only on testimonies, right? It relies on an entire range of documents, but this book really is about the personal. How did the Holocaust affect these children personally? And so testimonies are vital to that. And also research since the World Works research and Joanna Michli's research and Natalia Aleksiun's research, and I can go on and on. It shows the value, the importance of using these testimonies and not disregarding them because they were because accounts were given by children.
And there is a question that pertains, again, something I was hoping we would have a moment to talk about, and I can hear the tic-tac in the background. We're running out of time, but it takes us to the post-war, which is not the focus of your book, but you do peek into that experience. So there is a question. I know that some French convents refused to return Jewish children they hid during the war, especially if they had been baptized. Did you come across similar situations, a similar situation for Catholic religious institutions during doing this in Kraków? And if you can give us a word or two on what the post-war Jewish childhood, immediate post-war Jewish childhood in Kraków was like.
So the short answer to the first question is no, I have not encountered any cases of children being held in religious institutions after the war, which doesn't mean that did not happen. I just did not encounter that. But more research needs to be done about the Catholic institutions in Kraków, for sure. In terms of the post-war period, so this is an epilogue in my book, and I would have hoped that it was longer, but this is a separate topic that demands more investigation. And of course, the war did not end for the children in 1945. Children grappled with new challenges in their lives, the loss of their loved ones, loss of their homes, and being placed in religious institutions, having to cope with their changed identities. What did that mean to them? Another problem was persistent anti-Semitism.
There was a pogrom there, right?
Pogrom, exactly. So we have anti-Semitism, pogrom, kind of ideas about what to do with the children. Should they stay in Poland? Should they go? So there were different discussions about that. I do have to say that there is an interest, there's a large interest in the history of Kraków, both during the war. There were several books that came out examining different topics related to that history. In terms of the post-war, there's an excellent book by Monika Stemkin about Jewish return, the return of Jews, children and adults to Kraków, how they viewed that return, what happened to them, how did the neighbors respond to that return.
And I would love to ask you, this is a tricky question, but what questions that you posed for yourself when you were beginning this journey? What questions you didn't get answers to? What questions you walked away from this written fantastic book and still with no answer?
Okay, so I will talk about the ones that I am still curious about, and that is something we talked about: the role of Catholic institutions. That is the role of networks, Polish Jewish networks, in the trans-border rescue missions from Kraków to the mountain areas and on to Slovakia and so on. Another topic that I did not get to talk about in this book, and that's not because it didn't happen, but I could not find any sources, is about how some of the children in hiding were treated by their aid givers. And here I mean about sexual assault. Right. So that's another big question. And finally, the role of privilege. This is such an uneasy topic to write about. It was one of the central themes for the survival of the Jews, survival of some of the Jews in Kraków. And I think I will stop here.
What kind of privilege?
Privilege in terms of having a family privilege, a connection that could save you, or you think could save you, right? Because there was never any guarantee that if you had a job at Schindler's factory or in a Madrid a sewing workshop, that would guarantee a safety. But to some extent, it granted protection to the parents, to the children, and some of the survivors from, probably, I will not say most, but I want to be careful here, but some of the survivors, child survivors from Płaszów were able to survive because they were protected through their parents working for Madrid or Schindler. Another thing about privilege, and this is something that makes some people uncomfortable, and I had that in one of the first presentations I did about this topic. That entrance to the Krakow ghetto in March 1941 was by permission only. It was considered a privilege to enter the ghetto because it was only for Jews who were considered to be useful to the Germans, and everyone else had to move.
Yeah. This is fantastic, but it's, I think, as much time as we could have together, right? Christine, thank you so much, Joanna, for sharing your fascinating research with us.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for your expert moderation and for agreeing to do this with me. I really appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions.
Thank you so much to you both. It was a really fascinating conversation, really dug deep into the book writing process and the book itself. I've put a link to the book in the chat if you're interested. There's multiple ways to purchase it. So please do if you are interested. Congratulations again to Dr. Sliwa for her joint award. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our Ernst Fraenkel Prize Judging Committee, who offer their time and expertise pro bono so generously. So thank you. And finally, a thank you to, of course, all of our attendees for your questions and your interest. And the chat is full of lots of praise for you. So I'm going to just leave it up for a second so that they can come in. But thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you again to you both.
Congratulations, Jana.
Thank you so much, Natalia.